Welcome to another episode of Chat with the Archaeologist, presented by the Mesa Prieta Petroglyph Project. I am your perennial host, Chester Levosh, and today we have a special guest, Professor Judith Habicht-Mauche from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Before we get into the interview, I would like to give a couple of quick announcements. Of course, we are closed for tours during the winter season, so thank you for your inquiries about that, but we are closed. We are also starting to gear up for volunteer training for the coming year. So the trainings, you can kind of expect to hear something in spring, but we're starting to gear up for that now. For those who have expressed interest in training as a recording volunteer, thank you very much. I'll be in touch. For other volunteer opportunities, we also are very much in need of docents for the coming year. So whether you've previously been a docent or you're interested in volunteering with us for the first time, that's another volunteer opportunity. So please reach out to us for that. You can find more instructions on how to apply to be a volunteer on our website. And then I want to extend a special thank you to our supporters. First of all of our private donors who have participated in the winter appeal. This has been yet another successful winter appeal, so thank you very much. You all keep the lights on here. Chat with the Archaeologist is just a very tiny part of what we do, just very much one of the tips of the iceberg, if you will. We've got so much going on behind the scenes, and you might always see me here, but I want to give a shout out to my coworker, Sandy Romero. Sandy is our education coordinator, and in the last year has taken on a lot of extra duties without complaining, always very positive, and such a hard and dedicated worker for years with us. So shout out to Sandy, and your generous support supports folks like her, who, again, she's done so much, and she is in charge currently of delivering our grade school curriculum to area schools, among many, many other things that she does. We will also need volunteers to help us with office tasks, as well as trails maintenance and general facilities maintenance on the Wells Petroglyph Preserve. We expect to start doing that work again in the spring. So if you're, say, able-bodied, want to get some fresh air and help us restore and maintain the tour trails that our docents and guests use, it's an opportunity to see the petroglyphs. It's an opportunity to get some fresh air. We even provide snacks and refreshments, so reach out to us about those other volunteer opportunities as well. That's it for announcements. Thank you all for joining, and let's dig in. All right, I'm here with recently Professor Emeritus Judith Habicht-Mauche of the University of California, Santa Cruz. Judith, if you don't know Judith, which how can you not, Judith did her dissertation work on the interactions between the Rio Grande Pueblos and the plains. Did I get that right?
That's correct.
So Judith is one of the influential researchers for this area. You've also seen a few of Judith's former students on this stream, including Elliot Helmer and Emma Britton, Dr. Emma Britton, actually. So, and myself, of course. So Judith is very influential in this corner of the Southwest. We are very pleased to have her on board with the stream. Welcome.
Thank you, Chester. Nice to be here.
All right. So, Judith, I understand you'll be talking to us about Pueblo Glaze pottery.
That's right. I'm going to talk about the technology for the glaze paint, kind of what we know and what we don't know about how those paints were made, and the mystery of them being lost and or abandoned. And so that's what I'm going to talk about.
This is a very interesting subject, in part because it's really difficult to reproduce these glazes. And so there's the mystery about why they stopped, but also the mystery of how were they made to begin
Yes.
with.
Right. No one's been able to do it. I was going to talk about that. No one's been able to do it kind of as well or as consistently as the Native Americans were able to do it when it was a going concern. People have gotten close, and we do understand a fair amount about how it might have been done. But there's some secrets or some tricks that we haven't quite been able to figure out yet. Yeah.
And I've actually helped you with some of this research with the Upper Little Colorado collection, right?
That's right. And I'm actually going to show some slides from the Upper Little Colorado material, which is not yet published. So this is kind of preview of that research that you helped me with. You were my GSR for a bunch of that work. I
won't recognize any of the sherds, though. I was more on the side of the stuff in the test tubes.
Yeah, well, the sherds are really, the ones for that project are really tiny, and they've already been chopped up an awful lot. By the time we got them, they were already sliced and diced quite a bit because they had already been thin sectioned, and they'd already had NAA research done on them, and we were like just scraping off the glaze or trying to, ablate off some glaze on sherds. And that was really a great thing, that we could reuse material that had already been used for another research project, and so we weren't, that was destructive, and we weren't destroying additional material. We were just kind of reusing material that had been used by Andrew Duff in his dissertation research.
And I mean, a couple of interesting things on there. As my undergrad advisors made sure to emphasize to all of us, archaeology is an inherently destructive science. And sherd analysis is certainly a part of that. But could you explain for the audience what NAA is, and then what we did with the Upper Little Colorado collection?
Sure. So NAA means neutron activation analysis, and that is a technique for chemically characterizing. It's used to chemically characterize pottery. It needs a kind of beam line, these accelerators that are under football fields, and so it can only be done at a couple different places in the United States, like in Missouri and University of Washington and Texas A&M, which is where I've had some work done. But it gives you a whole suite of chemical elements, the chemical composition of the pottery, a kind of bulk chemical composition. And by using multivariate statistics, you can form chemical kind of groups. And then hopefully you can kind of, based on sort of where those chemical groups are most commonly found, you can make assumptions about where things have been produced. And Andrew Duff at the University, at Washington State, had done that previously for his dissertation on the material that we looked at from the Upper Little Colorado. And then what we did was that we looked at the glaze paint, particularly just the pigments, the glaze paint on the pottery. And we did two things. We looked at the isotopic composition of the lead, looking at the 4 stable isotopes of the lead and looking at the ratios of the 4 stable isotopes. We could source where the lead was coming from. So where the lead that was used as a flux or part of the pigment, which I'll explain in my formal presentation, was coming from based on those ratios. And the ratios have to do with the kind of geology of how the lead formed, in what kinds of contexts, and how long ago, and from what kind of source materials, right? So it's a part of the geologic processes of the lead coming into being, right? And then we looked at the composition of the glazes, their actual makeup, their kind of recipes, as it were, by using, and to do the lead isotope work, you do use a spectrometer. We used an inductively coupled mass spectrometer to do that. And to do the composition, we used a technique called laser ablation, ICP-MS, or so laser ablation, connected also to an ICP mass spectrometer. And in that case, you use the laser can be targeted just on the paint, and you can just ablate off just a little bit off the surface of the sherd, and that ablated material is sucked up a tube into the detector, and from that you get a whole suite of elements that are that make up the composition of the glaze. And I'm going to spend most of my time looking at what we call the major elements in that composition, which are the ones that are most likely to have been sort of actively kind of manipulated, that people actually mixed to actually get a kind of glaze recipe. And I'll show you some of the diagrams that were developed from, kind of came out of that research. And although you can look at like 50 elements, there's a smaller suite of them that relate to kind of the actual behavior of making the glaze. So,
wonderful. I think that's a perfect introduction into the sort of topic that you're talking on today. So, I'll hand it over to you. It's your show.
Okay.
Take it away.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen because I have a little PowerPoint. I don't remember all the buttons to push. Here we go. And can you see that, Chester? Is that all good? Okay. All right. So when Chester asked me to talk today, he said that this particular series of the chat, he wanted to be about kind of technologies or accomplishments of ancient peoples that might be generally unknown or unexpected, or maybe push back against some common stereotypes of non-Western or pre-modern peoples. And Central Pueblo glaze painted pottery is a great case to address these issues. The results of scientific studies of glaze paint, which began in earnest in the 1930s, so almost 90 years ago, have consistently challenged popular views of the ancestral Pueblos as simple peasant farmers living in isolated, self-sustaining rural villages. This is, after all, what Kidder called Anna Shepard's bombshell, right? The understanding that not just pots, but raw materials and pretty sophisticated technological knowledge were being exchanged through large scale regional and interregional economic and social networks throughout the Southwest during the late pre-contact period. Despite having known this for almost a century now, it is a lesson that even Southwest archaeologists have to continually relearn with each generation, precisely because of the way that our growing knowledge of glaze paint technology and how it was embedded in complex and large-scale social, economic, and cultural and ideological systems challenges really persistent stereotypes about the nature of non-state societies, not just in the popular imagination, but in the Western anthropological imagination as well. Glaze paint technology never ceases to surprise, amaze, and confound us. So first, some definitions. What is paint? Right? I'm talking about paint. Paint, and this is just the definition I got off of Google of paint. Paint is a colored substance which is spread over a surface and dries to leave a thin, decorative, or protective coating. When we're talking about paint on pottery, Owen Rye, a famous ceramicist, once said that paint really is a very non-specific kind of term, and it really refers more to the action of painting than to any kind of technical or specific materials. But when we're talking about ceramic paints, we're really talking about a mixture of pigments or colorants that are mixed in some kind of medium, usually a liquid medium, that allows them to be spread and to create some sort of design. On Pueblo pottery, most pigments were either minerals, ground up minerals, and the two most common were iron and manganese, or they used oftentimes organic materials, what's called guaco, or they took what's called Rocky Mountain beeweed, which is a plant, and the leaves from that plant. And just a second, my thing wants to update some software. I mean, we need to make it stop doing that. Sorry. Yeah, I know, but it was like any minute now, I'm going to shut down my computer and start rebooting. So I need to make it not do that. Sorry. So Rocky Mountain, I was talking about Rocky Mountain beeweed, which I'm sure many people have already heard of. And this was boiled down to make like a tar or pitch or resin. And then that was ground up and mixed with water and used as a pigment. That's what sometimes we call carbon painted pottery, or but that organic materials can also be mixed with minerals and mineral pigments. So you can have iron paint, but it uses organic, also has this ground up seaweed in it that is used as what we call a binder. And so the organic material helps the paint sort of stick to the surface of the pot, so it doesn't sort of brush off before you're able to fire it. So it makes it kind of sticky and lets it stick to what we call the greenware, the pre-fired pot. You can also use clays as paint. You can mix that clay in a suspension of water, what we call a slip, and then you get something that's called a slip paint. It's essentially a mineral pigment. And in the Southwest, usually the medium that people use to mix paints was usually just water. In other places, you can use oil, you can use blood, you can use egg whites, different kinds of media, but in general, in the Southwest, they probably just used water. This is just a picture of a Los Muertos polychrome pot from southern Arizona. And here we can use, the black paint is probably carbon paint, an organic paint, and then there's some red slip paint on a white slip background. So just to talk about that. Now, the word glaze is a much more technical term when we're talking about ceramics. So a ceramic glaze is a vitreous or glassy substance, which is actually fused, chemically fused to the surface of the pottery to form an impervious and decorative coating. This is both decorative. Glazes can be both decorative, but they can also be functional as well. They create a kind of hard, sealed, impervious surface to the pot. But they can also be incredibly beautiful and part of the decoration of the pottery as well. So based on the composition of materials that are used to make the glaze, mixed into the glaze, as well as the firing. So it's really the composition plus the firing, we'll talk about that more, that result in the colors and the different visual characteristics and visual effects of glazes, how transparent they are, or translucent, or opaque they are, and their different optical qualities. And I just showed you a picture here of a stoneware celadon glaze. This is generally considered some of the highlights of the glaze technology, ceramic technology in the world that was produced during the Song Dynasty in China. Just incredibly beautiful glazed pottery. Okay, so what we're talking about in the Southwest is something a little different. It's called glaze paint, right? So those two things together, right? So glaze paint which they had in the Southwest, is not an overall coating or sealing, but it's actually a pigment or a paint that's applied to the surface, but it is also glassy. It is a glaze. It has actually fused to the surface and become vitreous or glassy. But it's, rather than being an overall coating, it's used to develop these sort of decorative designs. So here's some images of glaze painted pottery from San Marcos and other sites in the Rio Grande. And you can see the light reflecting off of it. You can see how glassy or reflective it is because it is a vitreous material. But you can see that it's just used as a paint to draw these designs. Here's the red slip paint that's being used as filler. So this is a kind of a unique way of using glazes that the folks in the Southwest developed. And this first developed in around the end of the the end of the 13th century, the late 1200s. There are some earlier examples of glaze paint from like the late Basque-Maker to the early Pueblo period, but then there's this huge gap, and it's very unclear to us what the relationship of that earlier technology is to this technology. That was very short-lived, the earlier one. It didn't spread very far, and it didn't have a very long life. This tradition spread throughout much of the Pueblo Southwest, and it lasted for over 400 years. So it's a much more consistent, persistent technology. So here's just a map showing the different places where glaze painted pottery was made. Glaze painted, this technology probably first developed in the Western Pueblo area among the Zuni and other Western Pueblo groups around, kind of the last half of the 13th century, and certainly by 1275, we have pretty good glaze paints in this area. And then we believe that this technology probably carried by people, right, by migrants moving from areas of the Western Pueblo area, introduced this technology to the people living in the Rio Grande, the Pueblo people living in the Rio Grande, or again, towards the end of the 13th century. And I think probably most of that technology came from the upper Little Colorado area, which is the area that Chester and I were doing a little bit of a project on with Andrew Duff. And so this technology moved from the west to the east. Around the beginning of the 15th century, in the early 1400s, much of this area of the Western Pueblos became depopulated. People either moved to the Rio Grande, or they moved up to Zuni or to Hopi, to the places where Pueblo people live today in Western New Mexico and Arizona. Of course, people continued to live at Zuni, but the Zuni stopped making glaze painted pottery in the early 15th century. It was sort of reintroduced in kind of the historic period for a short period of time, but essentially they stopped at the beginning of the 15th century. But in the Eastern Pueblos, in the Rio Grande Pueblos, people continued to make glaze painted pottery from the late 13th century through the 14th century, the 15th century, the 16th century, and right up to the beginning of the 18th century. So it's a very long-lived tradition in that area. But people did stop making it right around the turn of the 18th century. And this was a time of a lot of social disruption, economic disruption, and demographic disruption for the Pueblos. It was during the colonial period. It was a time of right around the time of the Pueblo Revolt, this big uprising of the Pueblos where they actually kicked the Spanish out of New Mexico for about 16 years. And there's a little bit of glaze paint production after what we call the Reconquista, after the Spanish came back in. But essentially, the revolt was kind of the end of the glaze paint tradition. And so that's the question is like, this kind of correlation is not causation, but we wonder about what the relationship of those historic events are to the end of this technology. All right, so glaze paint technology was either lost or abandoned, right? We don't know whether people just lost the ability to do this, didn't have the knowledge anymore, didn't have access to the materials, or whether they actively, for one reason or another, chose to give this up. But after 1700 or so, no one made glaze paints anymore. And the knowledge of how to do it was, in fact, lost. And so Pueblo people, this was not a continuing, many other aspects of Pueblo pottery traditions have continued, but this has not. And so as Chester was talking about, we don't really know how to do it. And Pueblo people don't know how to, Pueblo potters don't know how to do it. Oftentimes they want to learn and they come to us and ask us how to do it. And we like, don't really know. And there have been a couple different attempts to do this, like Pueblo potters working with archaeologists or working with studio potters, or different combinations of those three groups working together to try to experiment and make pottery, but glaze paint. But the only way that they've done it is by cheating. Right. So I'm showing you a pot that I actually saw in a gallery on Canyon Road here in Santa Fe that was made in the late 1970s by a potter from Jemez, Pueblo, who was working as part of a kind of living history project at Pecos monument, right? And they were able, and this is, you know, beautiful pot, and it's not bad, you know, it's pretty. I was like, oh my gosh, look, they did do glazeware. But then I read about how they did it, and they had to use materials that they got from a potting studio, a modern supply. They tried to like grind up lead and grind up ore and do it, you know, in open fire, and they just were not able to be successful doing that. And that's kind of typical of people. People get close, but they're not able to produce it as successfully and as consistently. And the big problem is making it black. Right? These are lead-based glasses. Lead glass is clear. If you think about Waterford crystal or, you know, crystal lead wine glasses, reason that you add lead to glass is to make it bright and clear. And so how to get a lead glass that's actually black is a pretty tricky thing. And we haven't quite cracked the code entirely for that. Okay. So what do we know about glaze composition and how these glazes are made? Glazes are generally made up of three parts, kind of critical parts. One is what we call the network former or the glass former, and that is usually some kind of silica. Silica is quartz, right? Silica is, you know, sand is made up of mostly silica. But if you think about putting a piece of quartz in a bonfire, and these pots were all fired in open firings, you know, a piece of quartz is not going to melt in a bonfire, right? So you need some way to get the quartz to melt at a lower temperature. And in order to do that, you have to add other materials, mix other materials with the silica to get them to lower them, to get the silica to lower its the temperature at which it melts, right? And these are called network modifiers or fluxes. More commonly, we call them fluxes, right? And the kinds of things that it looks like the Pueblos added were lead. That's one of the most common ones and the most abundant that we see in these glazes. But copper is also a really important flux and was also used quite a lot. And then they also added manganese and iron, and how manganese and iron also function perhaps as fluxes is not entirely clear. The role that they played as fluxes, they may have been added more as colorants, but iron will in I think a reducing atmosphere act as a flux. And iron, the presence of iron in these glazes may have been important for the initiation of vitrification in the early part of the firing, in the part of the firing where it was really smoky and there isn't a lot of oxygen present, where it's a more reducing atmosphere. It may have helped initiate vitrification. But as I said, they may have also acted as colorants. They probably also used an organic binder to paint the glaze paints on in order to get them to stick on the surface. And the role of carbon is also something that we don't understand as well as we'd like to, is a colorant or possibly having something to do with modifying the glaze composition and enhancing vitrification. And then there are these things called intermediaries, and alumina is the most important one. Alumina makes the glaze more viscous, right? The more alumina that's in there, the more viscous, the less runny, right? The glaze is. And you want in a glaze versus a glaze, and this is one of the big differences between glass and a glaze, right? In a glass, you don't have so much alumina because you want the glass to flow. But on a glaze, on a pot, you want it to flow a little bit, right? But you don't want it to flow a lot or be really runny because it'll just run off the pot while it's being fired, and that's not good. And for a glaze paint, you want it to be even more viscous and less runny because you want to paint a line and you don't want it to run off that line. You want it to stay on that line when it fires. So glaze paints have relatively speaking, have a lot of alumina in them. Iron can also, under certain circumstances, act as an intermediary and strengthen the glaze and reduce its runniness. Now, silica and alumina are the main constituents, are two of the main constituents of these glazes. And so where does the silica and alumina come from? Well, clay is what we call an alumina silicate. It's mostly made up of alumina and silica. So the alumina and the silica and the clay actually comes from the surface of the pot, from the paste or the slip on the surface of the pot. And then you add these pigments, probably mostly these modifiers, the fluxes and the colorants, as a pigment, and within maybe an organic binder in a medium like water, and you paint that on. And then during firing, it actually melts the surface of the clay and melts the alumina and the silica off the surface of the pot to make the glaze. This is a thin section showing this little yellowy greeny stuff on the surface is actually the glaze paint and this is the paste of the pot. There's a little cross section ground very, very thin and glued to a microscope slide. So we're looking at it in transmitted light. So that shows you that glass right on the surface. Okay, so we've known that the composition of glazes, the basic composition of glazes, since the 1930s. There were these two young women, Anna Shepard and Florence Hawley, and who were young archaeologists in the 1930s. And interestingly enough, they both of their fathers were chemists. And their chemist father, and they were interested in glazing, and their chemist fathers, helped them to do some basic wet chemistry and early spectrographic work to determine that, in fact, lead was the main flux in most of these glazes. Lead and copper were the main fluxes that were used in most of these glazes. So we've known that for 90 years. We now, of course, as Chester was talking about, we now have much more sophisticated tools like electron microprobes and ICP-MS, which we talked about at the beginning. They give us much more precise measurements and also allow us to measure sort of simultaneously a whole suite of elements. So we're not just dripping acid on something and deciding that there's looking for some kind of reaction and going, oh yes, there's lead in there, like the old wet chemistry days. Now we can get a whole compositional profile for these glazes using these more sophisticated methods. This hasn't changed our understanding of the basic recipe for these glazes, especially the lead, copper, manganese combination, maybe with iron also added or iron being picked up from the surface of the clay as the major intermediaries, the fluxes and the colorants. But we can now see more precise differences in how the actual recipes for how these glazes are made and how those are different through time and how they're different from one area to another. So this is some of that data that Chester helped me with from the project that we did with Andrew Duff. And so these are glaze painted pottery from the upper little that were discovered, were excavated from or collected from the upper little Colorado area. But because we did that Andrew did that NAA work for his dissertation, we had a pretty good idea of where the sherds were actually, the pots, the sherds we had actually came from, where they were actually produced. So we knew where the pots were produced, and now we were looking at the composition of the glazes relative to these different production zones. And that's what we see here. These are log plots. And so this is the concentration of lead on this side, copper down here, and this is lead and manganese. The way you can kind of think about this is kind of over at this edge is a little bit, a moderate amount, and a lot, right? Again, little bit, moderate amount, a lot, right? So what we see is that the most common way to produce these glazes for the three major production areas that we were looking at, which was Western Zuni, the upper Little Colorado, and Silver Creek area on the Mogollon Rim in Arizona, was this kind of high lead, high copper, moderate amount of manganese recipe, right? Mostly, particularly, that was a recipe that was favored by the guys in the western part of the Zuni area. And they were very consistent about doing that. The guys in Silver Creek tended to prefer a glaze that was kind of high in copper, very high in copper, kind of high in manganese as well, those are little triangles, high in manganese, but had a very variable amount of lead, right? So they were less fussy about how much lead they put in. They were mostly focusing on copper as the primary flux. And so those were two different strategies, two different recipes, as it were, to make glazes. Interestingly, the guys in Upper Little Colorado, some people did it the Zuni way, some people did it the Silver Creek way, and some people were off doing their own thing, like they didn't get the memo, right? And they were sort of making it up as they went along, which is a kind of interesting thing. So we see these two very clear, distinct traditions, and then some people were following, you know, the people in Upper Little Colorado, some people were following the Zuni way, some people were following the Mogollon Rim way, and some people were just didn't have that information and we're doing it some other way. So that's the kind of thing that is more sophisticated chemical techniques can get us. But, you know, ingredients are not recipes, right? So I got Julia Child here, right? And, you know, if you think about, you know, say you have your grandmother's, I mean, what we're doing here with the glazes is as if we had a cake in front of us, and we put the cake in one of these spectrometers, and we got the chemical composition of the cake, right? What does that tell us about how the cake was made? Not very much, right? Or it may tell us some things. We can maybe figure out some, oh yeah, there was baking soda in it or something, right, like that. But it really doesn't tell us the technique, right? It doesn't tell us the art, right? And the craft of how this is done, and all those things matter, right? So if you think about, like, maybe you have a cookie recipe from your grandma, you have your grandma's cookie recipe, and it never turns out the way your grandma's cookies turned out, right? Because even following the instructions, even following the recipe is not the same as standing next to your grandmother and having your grandmother teach you how to do it, and practicing with her and really understanding the techniques and the artistry and the craftsmanship that goes into it. So, okay, all right. So glazes are a mix of the materials, the technique, and the magic that happens when you fire. Okay. All right, so we know something about the materials. Chester talked about, we talked about this at the beginning, right? That we know where the lead was coming from in particular. We can source that, and we can see using this isotopic ratios that everywhere that they made glaze paint in the Southwest over all time and everywhere, people were only using 2 sources of lead. Primarily, they experimented occasionally with something else, but primarily they were using 2 sources of lead. One is up in the Cerrillos Hills here, and the other main source was this Hansenberg source in the south, in Socorro County, right? So even people in Arizona, right, were coming to the Rio Grande to get the lead. And even though there was lots of lead in other places, and we don't understand that, like, why are they only using 2 sources of lead? Is it because those places were important? They were, you know, historically important, culturally important, ideologically important, so that having lead from there in the paint was kind of a piece of what we sometimes call a piece of place, of, you know, kind of relating back to that important place in the landscape. Maybe, right? We don't know that. And another thing that I've been thinking about, because it's like, why are they only using these sources? And one thing I thought is that I know in Cerrillos, one of the things that you have there is you have all the major constituents of a glaze kind of present right there. Like, you can collect manganese there, you can collect iron there, you can collect lead there, you can collect copper there. I don't know if that's true in Hansenberg, and I need to go find that out, but I had this kind of revelation about that when I was walking around the Cerrillos Hills Park, and the first mine that I got to was a manganese mine, and even though I collected lead there, I hadn't really thought about that, oh, there's also manganese there. And I was like, wait, there's copper here, there's manganese here, and there's lead here, all in one place. So that would have made Cerrillos a good place to go and collect the materials. And maybe that was true for Hansenberg too, but I don't know that. Otherwise, using Hansenberg lead is weird because it's out in the middle of nowhere and there aren't any communities there. So that's a mystery we don't understand, right? So does the source of lead impact its composition? And it looks like that's not true, right? This is some more data from the Duff Project, Upper Little Colorado. These are only sherds that we know were made in the Upper Little Colorado. And what we see is, and then these are the sources of lead for those sherds, the paint on those sherds. And what we see is, of course, most people are using that high lead, high copper, medium manganese formula. But so we see that both for lead that's coming from Hansenberg and both for lead that's coming from Cerrillos. It doesn't make any difference what the source of the lead is. It's the same kind of glaze composition. Of course, people are using other kinds of compositions as well, but it doesn't seem to be tracking on the specific source of lead. One thing that's kind of interesting is people who only use lead from one source tended to prefer a more specific composition for the lead. So they mixed their paint more consistently, right? But if, I guess I didn't show you this, you know, people did mix, sometimes they mixed ore from different sources. So they had whatever was laying around and they mixed it from both of these places. They don't seem to have cared so much about how they mix their paints. They're much more loosey-goosey about that, which is kind of an interesting thing. Okay, so some other things we think we know about what they were doing. It looks like they were using galena. There's many different kinds of ores of lead, but it looks like lead sulfide or galena is the one that they were using because we get a little bit of sulfur in our chemical compositions. It looks like we have like this one sherd from San Lazaro, which had like kind of unfired pigment on it. And Carrie Schleier looked at that with an electron microscope. It looks like they were abrading. Well, actually, the first thing they were doing was like kind of abrading it and grinding it up, and then the lead, and then roasting it. They're actually roasting it in a fire, and this drives off the sulfur and creates lead oxide. We have like one example of this, but it does seem like that makes some sense to do that, and it looks like they may have been doing that. Okay. And then what do you do? Like, and another thing, this question is like, how is this exchanged, right? Like, was it exchanged as ore? Did people come and mine the ore themselves? Did they come to villages and get the ore? Did they get it already pre-ground? Did they get it pre-roasted, right? Did they get it pre-mixed with these other materials? How did this move, and what form did this move around the landscape? Because we knew it does move, and then we don't know that really well either. Okay, fire. I want to talk about firing. Firing is like the most important thing, part of this whole process, right? They're firing in open firings, in reducing atmospheres at the beginning of the firing, oxidizing at the end of the firing. They are able to achieve these temperatures that are high enough to melt the lead. The surface reaction is really critical to forming the glaze, as I said, melting the surface. And this may have been the process that required the most skill, right? Interestingly enough. Scott Van Kuren did some interesting work on 4-mile polychrome from the Mogollon Rim, which is a glaze painted pottery. And he has like folks who like made authentic 4-mile polychrome, and he has these folks in other places that made kind of knockoff of 4-mile polychrome copies of it. And it's very clear that they could see visually the 4-mile polychrome and they were copying, but they didn't have all the information. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the composition of the glazes on those two kinds of pottery, they can be identical, like the exact same glaze formula, but the glaze on the 4-mile polychrome is beautiful and glossy and black and always vitrified, and the material on the other is not, and tends to not be as glossy, not as glassy, not as well made. So like they knew they had the paint right, but they didn't know how to fire it, right? The firing seems to have been the most critical part of all of this. So there's a lot we don't know, still don't know about how to make a glaze. As Chester said, it's still really hard for us to get people who replicated it, can't make it black, right? This is this picture I showed here. This is a little bird on two sides of a replicated pot, and on one side it has the nice black paint, and on the other side it's clear, right? And this is the same firing on the same pot with the same paint, and so that kind of inconsistency is really a problem. We don't really understand how the colorants work. What is the role of manganese, right? It sort of makes things darker. Maybe does seem to be important, but it's kind of inconsistent in our experimental work. Why do they mix all these different colorants into the paint? Maybe it was important to have raw ores that are of different colors, blue and black and yellow and red. May have been important for cosmological reasons because of the kind of color directional symbolism. We don't know who collected the resources, who made the paints, who decorated the pots, who fired the pots. Was it the same person or were these different people? And what does that mean about kind of gender divisions of labor in the production of this pottery, or how specialized each step was, or how sequestered or how restricted was the knowledge of each of these steps? So those are the kinds of things we don't know. As I said, sometime kind of towards the beginning, kind of in the 17th century, the quality of glazes becomes not as good. It becomes really runny, and we know runny means less aluminum, and chemically that's true. But why that's true, we don't understand. Is it a change of fuel? Are they using, cow manure or sheep manure instead of wood? Was this deliberate? Was it an aesthetic choice? Was it a choice to kind of obscure what were kind of religious designs from the priests? That's an idea that people have thought about. And then, as I said, during the Pueblo Revolt, people kind of gave up producing glazes entirely. And again, we don't understand why, right? Was it because of all this disruption? People didn't have access to the mines and the ores that they needed, the materials they needed. Did people die who had this knowledge, right? Was glaze paint associated with the Spanish, and therefore people didn't want to do it anymore? There's been lots and lots of different ideas, but we don't really know the answer to this. But what we do know, and again, we don't know if people gave this up. Yeah, okay. We don't know whether people gave this up deliberately or whether they just lost the knowledge to do this. But in any case, the production of glazeware for over 400 years represented one of the most sophisticated technological achievements of indigenous potters anywhere in the Americas. And as I stated at the beginning, its production still confounds and challenges us in many ways. So that's all I have. Sorry, I went over.
Our time constraints aren't hard and fixed on this show. So, there I am. I'm back with you, side by side.
Okay.
Absolutely fascinating and great to actually see what's become of the data from the Upper Little Colorado project since that was a few years ago. And
yeah, it was a while ago. Yeah.
I'm glad that you mentioned the lasers thing, because I mean that had to have been one of the coolest things I've got to do in my life, is to put on a lab coat and then target a laser to burn things. I mean that laser targeting, lab coat, come on, that's fun. I was actually hoping that you would share your catchphrase about what we do to sherds to get the information from them.
We torture them. we slice them, we dice them, we burn them with lasers, we soak them in nasty acids that would burn a hole through your hand. Yeah, we do all that stuff.
Fantastic. All right, so we have a couple of news stories and a book review, and since we're starting to run short on time, I'm going to skip one of the news stories and then just very quickly bring up, because this is a sort of transitional topic between your talk and our book review, which would be the Ostraka sherds that were recently uncovered by a collaborative team of Egyptian and I believe German archaeologists.
Right.
So for those in the audience who don't know what Ostraka are, they are ceramic pottery, often found here in the form of sherds, with writing on them.
Right.
I think some folks define it as incised on them, but that's not necessarily accurate, since these examples are actually painted on there.
Right. And it's usually something we associate with the Greeks, but in this case it's the Ptolemaic era in Egypt, and so there's some Coptic and Arabic and Greek writing. So that's kind of interesting, the one, that it crosses those different times and cultures as well.
Amazing find. I think they were estimating about 13,000 pottery sherds with this writing on them.
Right.
I expect that there will be quite a bit of research coming out about these in the coming years. Yeah. And now for our book review. This was a great suggestion. Kara Cooney's The Good Kings, which seems to have just come out.
Yeah, I think it did just come out. and I thought we needed to, support the UC brand. She's a professor at the University of California at Los Angeles, and a UCLA professor and an Egyptologist.
Yeah. So, do you want to introduce the book?
Oh yeah. So this is it's an interesting book. She's an Egyptologist. She's a professional archaeologist, and but I think this was based on some lectures that she did for a course, and he had transcribed. And what she's sort of doing is looking at, was it like 5 kings, I think, maybe six kings, and pharaohs at different times and different dynasties. And she's sort of talking about, says that, we really have this romance with Egyptology. She had a romance with Egyptology, and, a romance of, we romanticize the pharaohs. And, really these guys were kind of authoritarian jerks, right? Sort of, I think that this is, that we're kind of romanticizing authoritarianism, right? And the patriarchy. And so she takes these different ones and she sort of uses them as examples of different strategies of authoritarianism. Like Ramesses is like a populist strategies, or Akhenaten kind of religious fanaticism, and these different kinds of strategies that people use, or building the pyramids as a kind of make work scheme, right? Like it ends up creating the bureaucracy and a bureaucratic elite that actually challenges the authority of the pharaohs. Yeah,
it's absolutely a fantastic book, and I would first up, I just want to suggest it to everyone in our audience. It reads like Game of Thrones.
Exactly.
Fittingly, really gripping, and she provides a lot of the context for the strategies that each pharaoh, that each king used, including how previous kings' decisions sort of informed and limited their the sorts of strategies that they could use. So that kind of really sets the scene. I do have one critique, because this is one of my pet peeves. It was Flavor Aid. If we're going to make the Jonestown reference, they didn't drink Kool-Aid. It was Flavor Aid.
Flavor Aid. Yeah. The chapter, Akhenaten's chapter, was called Drinking the Kool-Aid, right? And she really kind of portrayed Akhenaten as a kind of religious nutcase, right? So, which is kind of a different perspective on him than the first monotheist, and it's just the way it's often portrayed. He was kind of a religious zealot nut job, and everybody had to follow him, and everybody had to move to a new town, and everybody had to stand out in the sun for hours and hours while baking in the sun, and in this half constructed place, and because the nutty king wanted to do that, right? But it wasn't Kool-Aid.
and I think that's actually a very apt comparison, because like Jonestown, like you said, he founded this whole new town. And while that seems to be a strategy that was employed by prior pharaohs as well as subsequent ones, the sorts of impacts and the hardships that creates are some...
That was a common strategy, right? They would just like move the capital, right? And so everybody had to shift, and this was a way of kind of breaking down the power of the kind of the bureaucrats, right? And this was a kind of also a theme, this kind of tension between the king, the pharaoh, and the elite, right? And the different strategies that different pharaohs had to do that. And she also makes this case that like kind of the most authoritarian person in the dynasty, right, was usually the end, right? That this was like the last gasp And it was really a sign that what we see, like with all these temples and beautiful statues, right, and inscriptions, was kind of always the last gasp, right, of the attempt to kind of hold on to power, right, rather than a sign of this kind of success. Right? And I thought that was an interesting point.
Yeah, and I very much appreciate that she emphasizes how in many of these circumstances they undermined education, they undermined well, the academics of their time, and that she, as a very self-aware academic and as an educator, very much believes in the power of education. So I think this, I mean, she's very explicit about how this all applies to today, and
Yeah.
We can certainly fill in the blanks about certain policies over the last several years that have worked to the detriment of academia and to the detriment of our education system quite broadly. Just one of the many tie-ins and parallels that she makes, but one that really struck close to home.
Yeah. Yeah, I like, of course, Ramesses is the one that she kind of, Ramesses II was the one that she kind of is the Trump of her her group, right? The populace, who had to have the biggest temples and the biggest statues, and even wrote like, this is the biggest temple and this is the biggest statue, right? Right, like, so yeah, so she does that, and I think sometimes that's really successful and really resonates, and sometimes it's maybe a little stretched, those analogies.
Yeah, I almost kind of feel like maybe Ramses II is more of a Ronald Reagan, especially in the way that his legacy is remembered.
Right, yeah.
But,
yes, that's true, because she said Ramesses II, was his propaganda was great because it still works today, right? Like that's the, if you're up against the wall with a gun to your head and say, like what's a pharaoh, that's one of the three that would come up, right? Yeah.
And I actually didn't realize that he didn't come from a royal lineage, that he was very much this populist sort of installed leader,
right,
which very much changes the way that I think about him, and I think that we should all think about him.
Yeah.
Absolutely gripping book. I don't want to give too much away. So many juicy details.
Right.
Definitely go out and get it. Great recommendation. I think that's all we have the time for today. Thank you for joining us, Judith, and everyone out there. Next month, it looks like our guest is going to be Dr. Alan Garfinkel Gold from the California Rock Art Foundation.
Great.
So, tune in for that.
That'll be fascinating.